She found her mother's name in a 1960 church ledger, but her mom never said she was there. You think you know the people you come from. You think names, dates, and stories passed around dinner tables are enough to build a truth. Until one day, you're standing in the basement of a church that hasn't heard a new hymn in decades, holding a book that smells like time, and you see a name that doesn't make sense. Not because it's unfamiliar, but because it's too familiar, and in a place it should never be. I found my mother's name in a ledger dated March 1960, buried beneath a stack of rotting pew cushions and sheet music modeled by silverfish. I wasn't looking for secrets. I was helping digitize church records for a historical project in Baton Rouge. A friend of mine had asked for volunteers. I had the time. And to be honest, I thought the quiet might be good for me. The church was called St. Winifred's, tucked between two oak-lined streets in a neighborhood that felt like it hadn't changed since the year that ledger was written. I was sorting through baptism records, cross-referencing dates, and names for the database. Most entries were routine. Some were heartbreakingly brief. Babies who hadn't made it past infancy. Others spanned generations, whole families layered in ink. And then I turned to page 47. There it was, in faded cursive, nestled between two other entries from that spring. Clara M. Delaney, born April 14th, 1959. Baptized March 4th, 1960. I froze. Clara Delaney is my mother. She passed 2 years ago. We buried her with a simple white rose cross and a sealed box of the few belongings she allowed anyone to keep. She never talked about growing up. All she ever told me was that she left Jackson when she was 6 and started her life for real in Shreveport. She didn't talk about childhood. No family visits, no Christmas cards from cousins. Just silence and occasional tension when I asked about the past. But this said she'd been in Baton Rouge before Jackson, and not just passing through. She'd been baptized here, officially, within the Catholic Church. I stared at the page, reading the line over and over, as if the ink might dissolve and prove me wrong. The handwriting was delicate, almost reverent, but there was something else. Beneath her name, in faint red ink, almost invisible unless you tilted the page just so. Received by directive. Do not pursue further entry. My throat dried. I looked back through the previous pages. The other names had no such markings, just place of birth, parents' names, baptismal dates, all in black ink. Only my mother's had been qualified, like a record someone had reluctantly agreed to keep. I didn't know what to do. I copied the page with my phone camera, heart pounding, palms sweating like I'd just stolen something sacred. Which, in a way, I had. A truth someone didn't want remembered. That night, I laid the printed copy on my kitchen table. I kept staring at it, waiting for something to change. The name didn't. The handwriting didn't. But the way I saw my mother shifted completely. Who were you, Clara? Why didn't you ever tell me you were baptized in a church you claimed never to know? And why would the church mark your record as something not to pursue? I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I kept thinking of all the times I'd asked her about her childhood, and she'd changed the subject like it was just another forgotten errand. Like the questions themselves were a burden. Now, I wondered if they were a wound. In the morning, I called the church office. A woman named Agnes answered. Her voice was light, polite, worn smooth by decades of answering small questions from older parishioners. I asked her, gently, if there were any archived notes from 1960. She said the official ledgers were all we had, but there were some back journals the old priests kept, locked away in the sacristy. Most hadn't been touched in years. She sounded uncertain, like someone not eager to revisit whatever dust lay beneath those records. I found an entry, I told her, with my mother's name, Clara Delaney. There was silence. You said she was baptized here? Yes. March 4th, 1960? Yes. Another pause. Longer this time. I remember hearing that name once, she said. Father Duval mentioned it years ago. Said she was a special case. But he never explained. What does that mean? He retired in '89, passed a few years after. He never wrote much down. But he remembered her? I think so, and there were only a few baptisms marked that way, with red ink, quiet ones. I didn't ask what quiet meant. I already knew. Something about my mother's entrance into that church had been hidden on purpose. Something no one wanted public. Maybe not even written. I closed my eyes and remembered the only conversation we ever had about religion. I was 17, packing for a church youth retreat. She'd watched me fold clothes into a duffel, hands still as stone. She'd said, "Just remember, not all churches are places of healing." That was all. Not bitter, not angry, just factual. I thought she meant someone had hurt her once. Now I wondered if it was more than that. I went back to the ledger the next day. I looked at the names around hers, other children baptized that same month, all accounted for, all with clean entries. I began to feel like the red ink wasn't just an edit, it was a warning. And then I noticed something else. A name crossed out on the previous page, not blacked out, just erased, like someone tried to remove it softly, but the indentation of the pen still remained. I shaded it with pencil. The last name was Augustine, no first name, no birth date. Just the ghost of a surname, hidden between two lines like it had never been meant to stay. I took a photo, printed that too. That night, I put it beside my mother's page. Clara Delaney. Marie Augustine? Was that her? And if it was, then who gave her the name I knew, and why? The hook wasn't just in the name. It was in the silence that had followed it for 60 years. I kept staring at the two pages pinned to my wall, one bearing the name I had known my whole life, Clara M. Delaney, written in elegant, almost reverent ink, and beside it, the faint indentation of a name someone had tried to erase. Augustine. It felt like I was looking at a before and after photograph of a woman who never wanted either version shared. A life split down the middle, not by trauma or distance, but by decision. Someone else's. I didn't tell anyone what I found. Not yet. I wasn't ready for what it meant, because to say it out loud would be to admit something I wasn't sure I could face. That my mother, the woman who had raised me with silence like armor, had once been someone else entirely. Someone abandoned, hidden, renamed. And no one ever told me. I spent the next few days combing through her old belongings. We hadn't packed much from her home when she passed. Just the essentials. Family photos, though there were hardly any. Her rosary beads, an old wooden jewelry box, Her recipes scribbled on lined index cards in blocky print. There were no baby pictures of her, not a single one. Her earliest photo was from high school, age 15. A passport-sized yearbook headshot, lips pressed tight, eyes looking somewhere just beyond the camera, as if the lens itself knew better than to ask for too much. No baby curls, no toddler smiles, just that single image, mid-adolescence, as if she'd begun her life fully formed. But there was one odd thing I hadn't noticed before. On the back of that photo, in faded pencil, someone had written, CD, 65, transferred from E Parish. I didn't know what E Parish meant. I thought maybe it was a school or a county, but something about it sounded like code, like shorthand for something no one expected anyone to question. I Googled every variation I could think of. East Parish Academy, Eastern Parish Youth Center. Nothing felt right. Until I searched E Parish Louisiana Orphanage, 1959. That's when I found it. East Parish Receiving Home for Girls closed in 1967, located 12 miles east of Baton Rouge, a temporary holding facility for unclaimed infants and morally compromised minors. The language on the historical site was cold, bureaucratic, and buried. But I knew. I knew. That's where she came from. It made sense in the most awful way. The missing childhood, the gap in her history, the deep discomfort she had around church events, the quiet shame I could never explain when people asked why my mom never came to parent prayer night at school. And suddenly, that phrase from the ledger made sense, too. Received by directive. Do not pursue further entry. She wasn't just baptized at St. Winifred's. She had been processed. I imagined her, not even a year old, bundled in a blanket with no tag, handed off by someone who didn't want her name spoken again. Someone who told the church, you may raise her, but you may not remember her, not properly. I imagined the priest dipping her into holy water, not to bless her, but to cleanse her from association. A child born of something the parish wanted to forget. Not evil, just inconvenient. I spent the rest of the night sifting through the few notes my mother left behind in her will. It was a thin file, mostly legal, but inside was a letter I had read 100 times and suddenly understood in an entirely different light. She wrote, "You were never the hard part. Being your mother saved me in a way no one else ever did. I didn't always know how to give you the history you wanted, but I gave you the truth I could live with. I hope one day you'll understand the rest." At the time, I'd read that line as poetic distance. Now, it read like a warning. She had chosen not to tell me, but she hadn't destroyed everything. She had left the trail half visible, maybe because some part of her wanted me to follow it. The next day, I drove to the site of the old East Parish Receiving Home. The building was gone, razed sometime in the early 70s, but the land remained. A stretch of overgrown grass and cracked brick foundation still ran along the base of what used to be a loading dock. There was no sign, no plaque, just quiet. I sat on the edge of the concrete slab and looked out at the trees beyond, trying to imagine what my mother might have seen from here. The sky, the feeling of not being chosen, the sting of becoming someone new before ever getting a chance to be someone real. I whispered her birth name, quietly, just to hear it spoken. Marie Augustine. It didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like recognition. And that's when I made the decision. If my mother couldn't tell the story, I would. Not to shame her, not to challenge her choices, but to finally, speak the name someone tried to erase. I never thought one erased name could pull the ground out from under me, but it did. Every step after that felt like walking through a version of my life I didn't know I'd been living. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The name, the directive, the orphanage that no longer existed, and the woman who had once lived there before she became my mother, before someone decided her story wasn't worth keeping whole. I went back to St. Winifred's 2 days later. This time, I didn't ask permission. The church was closed to the public that afternoon. A note on the door said they were repainting the altar, but the basement archives weren't locked. I'd helped organize them. I knew the smell of mildew and old hymnals, the way the light from the ground level window broke across the shelves like fractured stained glass. And I knew exactly where to look. There was a black filing cabinet labeled Pastoral Notes, Restricted. It had always been locked. But I noticed last week that the top drawer didn't quite latch. I wedged it open with a ruler. Inside were folders wrapped in old twine, yellowing with time. Most were sermon drafts, logs of weddings and funerals, things that didn't matter now. But halfway back, under a binder labeled Confidential D. Duvall, I found it. A slim leather notebook, embossed with the year 1960. It was cracked, soft in my hands, the way old things get when they've been held too many times. I opened it. The first page was a prayer. The second was a list of names, illegible, rushed, almost scrawled. And then this: child received from EP Holding, Marie A. Condition: malnourished, no papers. Recommended: spiritual reclassification, full name reassignment per diocese guidance. Future references: use assigned name, CD. No further notation allowed in parish records. This entry must remain private. I stared at those last words. This entry must remain private. Someone had written it down and still wanted it forgotten. But it wasn't forgotten, not anymore. I flipped through the rest of the pages. Most were empty. A few contained confession-style notes, but none referred to my mother again. Just that one entry, one paragraph, one decision: to erase a child and rename her Holy. And all I could think about, sitting there, cross-legged in the basement of a church, was how many others there had been. How many names had been replaced. How many histories had been buried beneath pews and polished crosses and the word redemption. I took photos of the page. Not to share. Not yet. But to remind myself that the silence wasn't accidental. It had been engineered. I returned the notebook, tucked everything back exactly as I found it. I didn't want to steal it. Somehow, leaving it there felt like a kind of proof that even secrets, especially the sacred ones, can still leave shadows. On my way out, I passed Agnes in the hallway. She looked up from her papers and gave me that same polite smile. "Everything okay, dear?" I hesitated. Then I asked, "Did you ever know her, Clara?" She paused. "The one in the ledger?" I nodded. Her smile faltered, just slightly. "I remember the day she came in. I was a girl then, maybe 10. She didn't cry like the others, just stood still, looking up at the cross like it might speak to her. She looked down at her hands. Father Duval said she'd been chosen for something better, that we weren't to ask questions. And you didn't? Her voice lowered. We weren't allowed. I thanked her and left, but the quiet followed me home like fog. That night, I opened the shoebox at the back of my closet, the one labeled Mom. It held what few artifacts of her life I'd kept after the funeral. A cracked locket, a pressed flower, her social security card, and beneath them, tucked behind a false bottom I hadn't noticed before, a folded scrap of paper. I unfolded it with trembling fingers. It was a hospital form, faded, dated March 3rd, 1960. Admittance: infant female, no known guardian. Name on intake: Marie A. Notes: infant left at E Parish Steps. No contact from family. And scribbled in shaky handwriting across the bottom: she is not your sin. She is your daughter. Let her be loved. I don't know who wrote that. Maybe her mother. Maybe someone who witnessed what the system tried to hide. But it hit me like a storm. Because for all the years I thought my mother didn't want to talk about her past, maybe the truth was simpler. She was never given the words to talk with. She'd been denied them, rerouted, renamed, reborn without choice. And now, for the first time, I saw her not as distant or cold or hard to know, but as someone who had survived being erased and built a life anyway. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table, the hospital form still unfolded in front of me, edges curling with age. I hadn't slept. My thoughts moved in slow spirals around names, paper trails, red ink, and all the things my mother never let slip. I whispered the name again. Marie Augustine. It didn't feel like a stranger's name anymore. It felt like a second heartbeat. The woman I knew, Clara Delaney, had been crafted, built atop another identity. Someone had erased a beginning and written a cleaner, quieter version. But I had seen what was underneath, and I could feel it breathing just beneath the surface of everything I thought I understood about her. It was strange, feeling closer to someone who was gone, only because I was finally learning who they were before they became who they had to be. And yet the further I dug, the more the silence made sense. Because in 1960, a name like Marie Augustine, attached to a baby born out of wedlock and handed over to the church by no one, meant shame, meant judgment, meant whispers behind veils and back doors. That child wasn't baptized to be saved. She was baptized to be made invisible, blessed by ritual, but marked by the people who administered it. That red ink was never sacred. It was a warning. I wanted to believe my mother had chosen to hide it out of peace, that she'd made her own kind of freedom. But part of me knew she had carried it with her always, stitched into her silence like a lining she never stopped wearing. I thought of the way she never sang hymns at Christmas, how she avoided baby showers, how she had nothing to say when someone mentioned first memories. All those things were not quirks. They were shields. And I started to see her differently, not as a woman avoiding pain, but as one who had survived being defined by it. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with all of this. I wasn't an investigator. I wasn't trying to write a book. I was just a daughter who found her mother in a place she never expected to, and discovered she had been looking in the wrong direction all along. So I did the only thing that made sense. I went back to the place where it began. I returned to the old plot of land where East Parish Receiving Home once stood. This time, I brought a folding chair, a thermos of coffee, and the two documents, the baptism ledger and the intake form. I sat there, listening to the wind move through the weeds. The land was quiet, but not empty. There was something in the silence that felt full, as if the ground still held onto stories the world had tried to forget. I read her name aloud again. Both of them. Marie Augustine, Clara Delaney. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was speaking to two people. I felt like I was witnessing one. After a long while, I stood and walked the edge of the property. There was no memorial, no trace that the place had ever held dozens of children whose names were filed, reassigned, or erased. But near the far fence line, I noticed something half buried in dirt. A stone, small, not a gravestone, more like a piece of tile, cracked across the middle. Someone had scratched initials into it long ago. M.A. My throat tightened. It might have been coincidence, maybe even something dropped years later, but I knew it wasn't. I knelt down and brushed the dirt from its surface. She had been here, not just as a name in a folder, but as a girl, a child, a presence. And suddenly I understood something I hadn't before. My mother didn't just avoid her past. She protected it, because if she had spoken it, she would have had to relive it, and maybe, just maybe, she thought silence was safer, for me, for her, for the version of life she worked so hard to build. But now, that silence had broken, and I wasn't afraid of the truth anymore. I was afraid of what would have happened if I'd never gone looking. That night, back home, I opened her old jewelry box. I hadn't looked inside in years. It smelled like cedar and dried roses. Tucked under her rosary was something I hadn't noticed before, a folded tissue. Inside it, a silver bracelet, tarnished, delicate. On the inside of the clasp, almost too small to see, were two letters engraved faintly, M.A. She hadn't buried everything. She'd kept one thing, her real name worn around her wrist in a bracelet too fragile for daily wear. It wasn't a rejection of who she became. It was a quiet remembrance of who she was forced to leave behind. And in that moment, I realized my mother didn't forget Marie Augustine. She carried her. The bracelet sat in my hand like a whisper too soft to hear. I traced the initials again, M.A., and I suddenly felt like I was holding the closest thing my mother ever gave to her own truth. Not through words, but through memory made metal, quiet, tarnished, hidden under lock and cedar and time. And yet, she didn't throw it away. For a woman who had erased so much of herself, she let this small fragment survive. It told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't trying to forget. She was trying to forgive. I thought about what that must have taken. To live in a world where your very existence was treated like a clerical inconvenience, where priests recorded your life in pencil and told everyone not to speak your name. And still, she raised me with grace. Not perfection, but dignity. She never once told me I was a burden. She never tried to make me carry the weight of her past. She simply pressed forward, one quiet day after another, building a life from silence. That's not weakness. That's strength I can barely fathom. But I couldn't let that silence win anymore, because now I knew. And once you know, once you see, you can't go back. You either bury it deeper or you let it rise. And I chose the latter. So I went back to St. Winifred's again. This time, not to sneak or photograph or peel back old ink. I asked for a meeting with the new pastor. A younger man, soft-spoken, with a kind gaze and fingers that seemed more suited for piano than scripture. I told him everything, from the ledger to the bracelet, from the erased name to the bracelet tucked in the jewelry box. I showed him the photos, the hospital intake, the priest's private notes. I didn't accuse. I didn't demand. I just said the words that needed to be said. She was a child, and she deserved to be remembered. He listened in stillness, like he had trained himself to hold space for other people's ghosts. When I finished, he said nothing for a long time. Then he opened a drawer, pulled out a registry notebook, and quietly flipped to a new page. "Would you like to enter her name?" he asked. I blinked. "Properly?" I said. "Yes," he replied. "Both names. The name she was given and the one she carried." I nodded slowly as my chest ached in a way I hadn't felt since we buried her. I picked up the pen. Marie Augustine, baptized March 4th, 1960. Clara Delaney, known in life, known in love. I didn't cry. Not then. The tears came later when I lit a candle in the back pew and sat in the same room where her name had once been footnoted in red. Now, it was in black ink, permanent, accounted for. I looked up at the stained glass cross glowing in late afternoon light, and I whispered to her, wherever she was, "They tried to make you a secret, but now you're part of the story." That evening, I sat in my car outside the church, watching the light fade through the window. I thought of all the other girls, like her, whose names were lost in ledgers, hidden behind euphemisms like special case or assigned anew. How many were born from scandal and never spoken of again? How many stories buried beneath false names and polished doctrine? And I realized this wasn't just about my mother. This was about the power of being seen, even if only once, even if only by one person. Because visibility is how we stitch together the pieces of what's been taken. And that's when I knew what I had to do. This story, her story, was not going back in a box. There's a strange kind of quiet that comes when a mystery resolves, not with a twist, but with a truth. It doesn't shout. It doesn't shine. It settles, like dust finally deciding where to land. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding the box again. The old cedar box my mother had kept tucked in her closet, beneath scarves and winter coats and years of careful forgetting. I'd opened it a dozen times now. The bracelet, the hospital form, the locket that never opened. But something had shifted. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was the silence between what I had found and what was still unsaid. This time, I lifted the lining, and beneath it, pressed flat against the wood, was something I hadn't seen before. A folded envelope, yellowed, fragile, sealed with wax, long cracked and faded. No name on the outside. My breath caught. I opened it carefully, afraid the paper might tear under my fingers. Inside was a single sheet, faint handwriting, looping and graceful. It was a letter, not addressed to anyone by name, but I knew it was meant for me. If you find this, it means I never found the words. Maybe I never believed I was allowed to. I grew up inside a silence built by others. They said I should be grateful to have been cleaned of where I came from. But I was never dirty. I was just born. That's all. I was someone's mistake, maybe, but I made sure you'd never feel like one. They gave me a new name, a clean slate, and I took it because it was the only way forward. But deep down, I remembered her. The little girl left at a church door. I never told you because I didn't want you to carry what I still couldn't set down. But if you're reading this now, maybe you've already found her. Maybe you gave her back her name. And maybe, just maybe, you gave me back a piece of myself, too. I never wanted to be a mystery. I just wanted to be your mother. But now, I hope you see, I was always both. I didn't move for a long time. There was no sobbing, no dramatic swell of grief, just stillness. And then something softer, peace. Not because the past had been rewritten, but because it had finally been read. My mother had spent a lifetime trying to protect me from what had shaped her, and in doing so, she'd unknowingly planted a trail for me to follow. She left behind no photos of her childhood, no stories of her beginnings. But she left pieces. Letters, scraps, names whispered between documents. And now I could hold them all. The church eventually honored her story in their records, both names inscribed side by side. No red ink, no asterisks, no erasure. Just truth. And I wrote a short note of my own. I placed it back into the cedar box with her bracelet. It read, "She was not their shame. She was my mother, and she was loved." I closed the box gently and tucked it back on the shelf, not to hide it, but to preserve it, because some stories shouldn't be buried. They should be kept. And someday, when someone asks about my mother, not just the name she lived with, but the one she had to leave behind, I'll tell them everything. Because now, I finally can.